Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Clive Wynne. I'm a professor of psychology at Arizona State University here in Tempe, Arizona, where I direct the Canine Science Collaboratory, which is a research group dedicated to trying to understand the relationship between dogs and their people, and also the relationship between dogs and the wild canines like wolves, from which all of our dogs are descended. So I'm fascinated by everything about dogs. Everything about dogs obsesses me, really. The intricacy and intimacy of dogs' lives in human society. Today, I want to talk to you about this very fundamental question, but a question that has implications for how we live with our dogs. I want to talk about what makes dogs special. Because we all know dogs are special. There is no other animal with which people have had a longer relationship than with dogs. Dogs and people go back over 20,000 years. Dogs entered people's lives before any other living thing was domesticated. Not just any other animal, but any other thing of any kind. Before there was wheat, before there was barley, long before there were cattle or goats or sheep, dogs have been a part of human lives. And today, nearly 1 billion dogs live on the surface of this planet. Dogs are an exceptionally successful animal. Everywhere that humans live, dogs live too. That's quite amazing when you think about it. And then think about your own life with your own dog. Our dogs are intimately interwoven into our lives. Back in the good old days, when we used to be able to get together for this kind of a lecture, I like to ask my audiences to raise their hands if they have a dog. And if somebody comes along to a talk by me, most of them have a dog at home. And then I ask them to leave their hand up if they let their dog sleep on their bed with them. And usually over half of my audience let their dogs sleep on their bed, as do I. My dog's sleeping behind me while I'm giving this lecture, but in the night, she sleeps on our bed with us, and why not? And then I ask my audience to just think for a moment about how many other human beings would you be willing to let sleep on your bed with you? And of course, that gets a laugh, but I'm trying to make a serious point. And the serious point I'm making is that your bed is one of the most intimate, private spaces in your life. Most of us would not be willing to allow a particularly large range of other human beings to share that private, intimate space with us. And yet we share it with our dogs. So dogs are very, very special. Very, very special. How did they get to be that way? What is the secret of their success in our human societies? That's my question for us. Now, if you just throw this question out among people who care about dogs, a lot of them might say, well, dogs are especially intelligent. They're especially smart. They have particular ways of understanding things that are what make them stand out. Now, this is the part of talk where I sometimes lose friends, because I have to tell you that I do not believe that it's their intelligence that has made dogs so successful. And we're going to talk very quickly, just in passing, about a couple of examples of great intelligence of dogs. And I'm afraid I'm going to tell you that for all that I'm impressed by these dogs, I don't actually think that this adds up to anything particularly special. I'm going to talk about Chaser and some other smart dogs. I suspect that many of you have already heard of Chaser. Chaser was the dog that the BBC called the world's smartest dog. Why did they call her that? Well, because it was demonstrated that she knew the names of over 1,200 distinct objects, toys, and so forth. Chaser was the dog of John Pilley. Both John and Chaser are now deceased these last few years, unfortunately. John Pilley was a retired psychology professor. His wife felt that he was at a bit of a loose end, and so she got him a puppy, a border collie puppy. This was now, let me think, this must be over 10 years ago. It could be 12 or 14 years ago. And it was around the time that some researchers in Europe published some scientific papers where they tested some dogs who had been brought to them these researchers had not trained the dogs themselves, but members of the public had brought them dogs and had said, hey, we have a really exceptional dog. Our dog knows the names of over 300 objects. So it was the family, the member of the public that had trained the dog. They just brought it to the scientists. The scientists carried out some simple tests and ascertained that indeed this dog did know the names of several hundred objects. John Pilley in South Carolina, he was at Wofford College in South Carolina, he got to hear about this. And he thought it would be interesting, since he had this new puppy from a breed that's reputed to be so intelligent, he thought it would be interesting to try and train this dog and see how many names of objects the dog could learn. And so for 3 years, pretty much every day for 3 hours a day, John worked with this dog, training the dog over and over again to get her to understand that each object had a unique name. A toy, he would write a name on it with an indelible marker, and he would train her to fetch the object using the name. And then every month he would test to see if she really had grasped the names of the objects. And over the 3-year period, the number of objects she remembered the names of got longer and longer. About a decade ago now, I had the wonderful experience of going and visiting John and Chaser in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And on the back deck, John had many boxes piled full of the toys that he had bought and given names to and trained Chaser the names of. And John said to me, Clive, go out on the back deck, grab a dozen of these toys, just any ones you want at random from these boxes, place them behind the sofa in my living room while Chaser and I wait out the front of the house so we cannot see which objects you've chosen. Write the names that you see written on these objects, write those names on a notepad for me. When you're ready, call Chaser and I back into the living room. I will sit down facing away from the toys, and I will read out the names one by one, and I'll ask Chaser to collect them. So that's what we did. And John would say, okay, Chaser, go get Lips. One of them was called Lips. It looked a bit like a pair of lips, just a squishy toy. Okay, Chaser, go get Lips. And Chaser would run around behind the sofa, look at the pile of objects, grab one of them, bring it back to John, and she got it right. Again and again and again. I do not now remember exactly how many toys I tried, but I did this. I grabbed a dozen toys at least 4 times, and Chaser never made a mistake. She always got it right. So as I say, the BBC calls her the world's smartest dog, and you can see that she really has some pretty exceptional intelligence. But 2 things. The first thing is that the process by which this dog learned that each object had a unique label or name was a process that actually Ivan Pavlov, the great Russian psychologist from 140 years ago, he would have recognized that process. The actual process of learning these names was not exceptional in itself. What was exceptional was the sheer number of them that she learned. Most of you probably find that your dog knows no more than half a dozen words. My dog probably knows 2 or 3. Your dog's probably smarter than my dog. Your dog probably knows half a dozen. Very few dogs get anywhere near Chaser's achievement. So Chaser is not typical of dogs. If we're talking about dogs in the round, if we're going to make generalizations that can apply to the whole 1 billion dogs on the surface of this planet, Chaser cannot help us with those generalizations because Chaser is quite exceptional. And furthermore, Chaser's exceptional nature doesn't lie in any special form of intelligence or smarts or cognition, whatever you want to call it, but in an unbelievably intense work motivation. Some people who don't know much about Border Collies criticize John Pilley for working his dog so hard, 3 hours a day, every day for 3 years. Those are people who don't know what Border Collies are like. Border Collies need work. They have an unbelievable drive. And if you don't keep your Border Collie busy, your Border Collie will make work for himself and get into trouble. So the Chaser, why did they call her Chaser? She had an unbelievable drive to run after things. That was her whole reward for getting things right, is that John would throw it and give her the chance to run after it and bring it back. So I think that Chaser's apparently exceptional intelligence is actually a very basic form of intelligence, as I say, that Pavlov would have recognized, taken to an unbelievable extreme, because this was a dog with a stunning work motivation. And of course, we mustn't overlook that John Pilley also had very intense motivation to see what could be done. And he was a smart guy. He was a psychology professor. He knew how these things work. He put his knowledge into practice in the form of his dog. So, people, I'm sorry, but I don't think Chaser was really exceptionally smart in a strong sense. Okay, Chaser, one example. My personal favorite example of what some people call intelligence in dogs is actually the explosives detection dogs. A lot of us, myself included, like to say, on occasion, my dog saved my life. And we don't mean the dog dialed 911. We mean that we were at an emotional low point, and the emotional support that our dog gave us was uplifting. And we call that, informally, metaphorically, saving my life. But the truth is, there are dogs that literally, not figuratively, literally save your life. In the good old days when we used to travel places, dogs worked at the airport, sniffing bags, some airports actually sniffing the passengers, certainly sniffing the empty planes. When we used to go to sports gatherings, football stadiums, certainly here at Arizona State University, our campus police have 2 sniffer dogs. Before every major sporting event, those dogs sniff their way through the whole football stadium. They are literally saving our lives. And I love this. I find it fascinating that the dog can achieve something that a human cannot achieve. But we should be clear here, if we're going to be precise about what we're talking about, what's exceptional here is not the animal's intelligence, but the animal's nose. Dogs do this for us because they have noses that are thousands or tens of thousands of times more sensitive than ours. The actual process, as shown in this photograph, of training a dog to tell us what it can smell is a process, again, that would not surprise Ivan Pavlov in its details, and that again relies on human ingenuity and human patience and motivation. It takes many months to train these dogs to do this reliably, so they end up being very expensive individuals. But the expense comes from the human effort of training them. So again, I know people think of this as intelligence, but we're not using our terms precisely if we call sniffer dogs smart. They're not being smart. They're well trained and they have sensitive noses. If I have more sensitive vision than you, I don't get the right to call myself smarter than you. That's a different thing. That's my senses, not my intelligence or cognition. Okay, one more example. I'm not the first person to ask myself as a scientist, what is it that makes dogs special? Dogs were largely forgotten in the middle years of the 20th century. But towards the very end of the 20th century, there was a revival of interest in dog behavior, specifically in dog behavior and interaction with human beings, and very specifically around this question, what makes dogs special? 2 scientists can be credited with reawakening interest in dog behavior. And that's Adam Miklosi, who's a professor at the University in Budapest, Hungary, and Brian Hare, who's now a professor at Duke University in North Carolina, but when he was doing this, was a young guy working in Germany, Leipzig, Germany. As far as I know, these 2 in the early phases didn't know of each other's work, but their research was moving on very parallel lines. And they appear to have independently proposed that the secret of dogs' success in human society and the thing that happened to them over the process, the evolutionary process we call domestication, the process by which certain wolves evolved to become dogs, to become a special kind of wolf, if you will, that knows how to live with people. Brian Hare and Adam Miklosi proposed that what developed was special skills in understanding people. They argued that dogs have an ability unique in the animal kingdom to understand people's intentions. Now, we could do a whole day, if not a whole weekend, on what could be meant by saying that a dog understands human intentions. We don't have that much time together today, so I'm going to just tell you about a single kind of study. This is the kind of study that has been most commonly carried out to address this question, and it also has the delightful advantage that it's very, very simple. Simple experiments are always the best for a whole bunch of reasons. Among them are, you can easily try this on your own dog. Be interesting to see what you find. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand between two containers that you've placed on the floor, one to the left of you and one to the right of you. You're going to have a friend hold your dog back 2 meters back, roughly 6-7 feet. Depends a little bit on the size of the dog, obviously. You're going to get the dog's attention. You're going to say, hey, hey, and then you're going to point at one of these containers. And in the frame grab from video that you see there, you see one of my past students, Ph.D., who's now faculty at Oregon State University, and she's pointing at a container to her right. If you try this for yourselves, you will find, most of you will find, that most of the time, your pet dog will follow your pointing gesture. You do need to convey to the dog, because the dog may get bored, you do need to convey to the dog that there's some purpose in doing this. If the dog goes where you point, you should give the dog a treat, or you might hide a treat in the location that you're pointing to. Most of the time, most people find that their dogs will do this. But what makes this special? According to Brian Hare and Adam McCloskey, this is something only dogs can do. I already mentioned that all of our dogs are descended from gray wolves. Over 20,000 years ago, a certain tribe of wolves started moving along with the humans, and over many thousands of years, they gradually became these more friendly animals that we love today. If somebody wants to claim that dogs have a special, unique skill that is a consequence of their living together with human beings for thousands of years, well, then that person needs to try testing their test on wolves to see whether the wolves can do it. Brian Hare tested hand-reared wolves in Germany and in Massachusetts. He said wolves cannot do this. Adam McCloskey and his students in Budapest, Hungary, actually got some wolf pups of their own and hand-reared wolf pups in apartments in Budapest, which seems like a pretty crazy thing to do, but they did it. And then they tested these wolf pups and they said, yeah, no, the wolves cannot do this. And so they both sides of the Atlantic independently said, this is the secret of dog success in human society. Dogs have unique abilities to understand human intentions that their ancestors, wolves, do not have. So they must have developed in the evolutionary process of domestication over the 20,000 years from wolf to dog. When I first heard this, I had no particular reason to be skeptical about it. But then I got an email from Wolf Park in Indiana. At Wolf Park, they have been hand-rearing wolves since 1974. So they really know what they're doing. They are the world's expert on how to raise a wolf pup so that it is comfortable around human beings. The people who work at Wolf Park spend their days with the wolves that they've known since the wolves were 10 days old. And they all have dogs at home. They go home in the evening, they go home to their dogs. So there are hardly any people on earth who have a more nuanced understanding of the similarities and differences between wolves and dogs. And they wrote to me because they could not believe what they were reading in the scientific literature from Budapest, Hungary, and from Brian Hare and his colleagues. They said that so far as they could tell, the wolves that they spent their days with were every bit as responsive to what people were doing as the dogs that they spent their evenings and weekends with. So they invited me to come out to Wolf Park to try these experiments on their wolves and see what we found. And cutting a long story and an exciting phase of my life, super short, we went out there, we pointed at containers, and the wolves could do it. They went where we pointed. So this photograph, a frame grab, a slightly later phase of this study. This is Lindsay Meerkam, who's now on the faculty at Monmouth University in New Jersey. And there she is pointing at a container, and you can just see in the corner of the shot a wolf beginning to trot to where she's pointed. It turns out wolves can be every bit as good at this as the best performing dogs. Let me mention before I pass over this, it's also the case that there are dogs that do not follow human pointing gestures. It's not hard to find dogs who will fail on this test. And in the meantime, many other species have been tested on this capacity. And a recent review paper found 38 different species. Individuals from 38 different species can follow human pointing gestures if, and this is crucial, they are raised around human beings and have a lot of interaction with people. Because it turns out that the secret to an animal's success or failure in paying attention to what people do is not so much what species that animal comes from, but what kind of life experiences the particular individual that you are testing today has had. Because it's all about wanting to be in a relationship with people and needing to pay attention to what people do. If people's hands deliver good things to an animal, that animal will learn to pay attention to the hands and where the hands are going. That's the clue to success on the pointing task. Okay, so at this point, I have convinced myself that it is not their smarts that makes dogs special. And it was around this time, this must be getting on for 9 or 10 years ago now, that a journalist came and visited me when I was still at the University of Florida. And he was traveling around the United States with his dog, Casey, visiting with people and talking to people who had something to say about dogs in modern America. And he wrote it all up in a book. And when he visited with me, he seemed like a nice guy, bought me a coffee, we had a nice chat. Afterwards, when he got home and wrote about me, it turned out that I'd made a sort of a negative impression on him. And so he wrote in his book, he wrote, Florida's Canine Cognition and Behavior Lab was led at the time of my visit by psychologist Clive Wynne, a former pigeon researcher, it's obviously a bad thing, considered by some to be the Debbie Downer of the canine cognition field. So, it's not like you get into science to win popularity contests or anything. It's not important in a bigger sense. It doesn't affect my professional development. My annual review didn't mention my Debbie Downerism. But at the same time, it made me realize that I had stumbled into a situation where people were misunderstanding me, and I was responsible for that misunderstanding. So up until this point, I have been, in effect, without setting out to do this in the first place, but in effect, I have been debunking other people's claims about what makes dogs special. They said dogs have a special kind of intelligence. I said, no, you're wrong. Dogs don't have any special kind of intelligence. What they have is perfectly ordinary animal intelligence. It just shows up in interesting ways because they live so closely with human beings. So I was telling people what I thought dogs were not. And that led people to think that I was claiming dogs don't have anything special about them. And that's certainly not what I thought. And so I realized that it was now incumbent upon me to explain what I think does make dogs special. And I realize that when I tell this story now, it almost seems too cute to be true. But you'll just have to believe me that this is honestly how things transpired. So you can tell from my accent that I wasn't born in the United States. My family and I moved to the United States, to the University of Florida in the early 2000s. And although my wife and I both had dogs in our pasts, we didn't have a dog. We weren't sure, there were a variety of reasons. We had a new baby and we weren't sure we could cope with a dog and a baby. And we'd come to a new country and we weren't sure if we were going to stay. And it's very difficult moving animals internationally. So we didn't have a dog. The first few years that I was doing dog research, I didn't have a dog of my own. And then, this is like 8 years ago now. No, yeah, 8 or 9. Anyway, then we got a dog. We got a dog from one of the local animal shelters. This is her here. This is Zephos, and she's sleeping behind me now. If I say her name sufficiently frequently, she might get up and say hello. We got this dog, Zephos, and it was immediately apparent that even given my skepticism about dog intelligence, it was immediately apparent that we had not acquired an especially smart dog. And that remains my conviction that Zephos is not a very clever dog. But it was also immediately apparent that she had a very strong personality trait that shone out of her. And that was what lay people would just say. She was very loving. She showed us that she loved us from almost the first moment she came home with us. Even in the kennel, when we were in the shelter, when we were looking for dogs, she immediately seemed very, very affectionate. And she remains that way to this day. If you came and visited me, she would make a big fuss about you, and she would show a lot of affection towards you as you arrived and as you said hello and as you came in and you settled down. And then as we all became more settled, maybe we sit down and have some coffee or whatever, you would notice that she would come back to me and you would notice her affection towards me. Now, Zephos shows this especially obviously, but actually this is what's been true of every dog that's ever been in my life, is that they are very loving beings. I'm hardly telling you something you didn't already know. Everybody knows dogs are very, very loving beings. But from a scientific point of view, nobody had thought to make this affectionate bond, this loving relationship, as part of a central explanation of how come dogs can be so special. So in the second half of this talk, I want to tell you about how people love dogs, just fairly quickly, just one study, because I just love that study, and how dogs love people. And my take home is going to be that it is the love that people and their dogs share that is the essence of dogs' success in a human-dominated world. And that's the story that I tell in my book, Dog is Love, Why and How Your Dog Loves You. So there's a lot more of this kind of stuff in there. So first, let's talk about how people love dogs, which in itself is a massive theme. And because I think of myself as primarily somebody who studies the dog behavior rather than the human behavior, my group has never done a lot of studies on this, but I have one study that I'm especially proud of and want to share with you. And this study came to me, the idea for this study came to me from traveling around the world and seeing dogs in different parts of the world. Now, here we are, we're in the United States, the wealthiest nation on earth. I often give talks around the United States or in Western Europe, also one of the world's wealthiest corners. Here in the US, in Northwestern Europe, almost all the dogs you will ever see will be the personal property of particular human beings. They will be people's pets. They will be their legal property. They will live inside homes. It's more and more rare that dogs sleep outdoors in kennels or anything like that. They are house pets. But if you leave our first world pocket and you move, here I am in Phoenix, Arizona. If I was to drive 4 hours south of here, I would be in Mexico. And from the Mexico border to the very tip, southernmost tip of South America, Terra del Fuego, dogs live quite differently. Of course, there are pets, just as we have. So there are people who have pet dogs in Mexico, in Colombia, in Argentina, in Brazil, whatever you want to name. But you will also see dogs all over the place on the streets, all the way through Mexico, Central America, South America. Dogs live out on the streets, scavenging for what they can find on trash dumps and wherever else. Likewise, if you're in Europe, if you go down to the south of Europe, to Spain, to Italy, you begin to see some dogs on the streets. If you go east in Europe, you go to Eastern Europe, Romania, further east, Russia, out into Asia, go down into Africa. When you look, I said there are about 1 billion dogs on the surface of this planet. Probably 3/4 or more of that 1 billion dogs are not pets. Pets are the minority. The majority of dogs live freely on the streets. Here's a photo I took of a rather handsome dog on the streets of Nassau in the Bahamas. The Bahamas is not a third world country. It's not perhaps as wealthy as the United States on average, but it's far from being a third world country. There are cultural reasons why the people of the Bahamas actually like having dogs on their streets. They see this as an expression of personal freedom that they greatly value. That's a whole another discussion as to the appropriateness of letting dogs roam on the streets. For now, I just want to point out that roaming the streets, living freely is very common for dogs, and it's a very dangerous life, and there's very high mortality among dogs living on streets. Free-living dogs are very unlikely to make it to their first birthday. And why is that? While I was in the Bahamas, I visited with a social scientist, William Fielding, at the College of the Bahamas, who has done a number of studies on people's attitudes to the animals. And he was sharing his impression that in the Bahamas, as elsewhere, very few puppies make it to their first birthday. And he had the suspicion, he had the idea that the clue to succeeding and surviving to your first birthday for a dog pup is if your mother, when she gets tired of you, which mother dogs do, weaning, 8, 9, 10 weeks of age, that's the end of parental care in dogs. If the mother around weaning time dumps the puppies near a human home that isn't already caring for any dogs. And I thought that was an interesting idea, and it connected in my mind with a thought I've had for a long time. It's been an idea that's been floating around since the 1940s, an idea of the Austrian ethologist Konrad Lorenz, that there is something about the young of all species that people find attractive. He called this, being a German speaker, he called this Kindchenschema. We could just call this baby features. The idea is that the baby features of a young individual, be it a human baby, a dog puppy, a goat kid, whatever it is, they all tend to have certain commonalities. And that is that the eyes of the young are disproportionately large compared to the size of their faces. Their noses are disproportionately small, and their mouths are also smaller and with a certain cute upturned sort of look to them. This is what Konrad Lorenz called Kindchenschema, this idea that the young of all species appeal to us. But at least since my own son was born, I've had the feeling that it might be possible to be too young to be cute. And a lot of people joke about how newborn babies are actually not that cute, right? And I've had the same thought about newborn puppies, that they're not that cute either. And so I thought, nobody's ever done this. It would be interesting to see how cute do people find photographs of puppies of different ages. And I had a wonderful student, an undergraduate at the University of Florida, Nadine Cassini, who had friends who bred dogs of several different breeds, Jack Russells, Cane Corsos, and White Shepherds. And these friends provided us with a rich set of photographs of the heads of these puppies from birth, as young as you could snatch a photo of the puppy's head, through to 7 months of age. At the younger age steps, they were every week. As the puppies got older, they weren't quite as frequent, every couple or 3 weeks, but good enough. And we just showed these photographs to people on a computer screen, show them a photograph on the computer screen, and underneath the photograph, there's a slider across the bottom of the screen that people could slide with the mouse cursor to indicate how attractive they thought that puppy was. From not at all attractive to, yeah, this is the cutest pup I ever saw, okay? So we show them the photographs of different ages. And what I'm interested to see is it perhaps the case that the youngest ones are not the cutest ones? That the cutest ones perhaps might be just around weaning age, 8, 9, 10 weeks of age, where their mother is kicking them out, and where if humans do not step in, the puppies are very likely to die, if they were free living on the streets, that is to say. So we show people these photos, and this is what the data looks like. Along the bottom of the graph, you see the age of the puppy in weeks from birth to 30-something weeks. And going up the graph, you see the average attractiveness rating that our participants gave to these photographs. And this upturned U shape indicates that we found exactly what I thought we might. That is to say, The maximum cuteness is, as it says down the bottom, the maximum cuteness of this function fitted mathematically comes at 7.7 weeks. So for the Jack Russell Terrier, it's almost exactly at weaning age that the dog pups are maximally cute to human beings. The youngest ones are less cute, and they also get less cute as they get older. That's the Jack Russell. Here's the Cano Corso, which is a big, heavy South American breed of dog. And you can see the same shape of the function. In this case, the mathematical formula tells us that the perfect moment of maximum cuteness is 6 weeks, which is a little bit younger than I said. But you can also see that there is one data point which is a bit anomalous, and that the overall shape of the function and the overall place where it's reaching its maximum is, again, around the same age. And finally, the White Shepherd, which is just a German Shepherd with white fur. Here, once again, the moment of maximum cuteness for the White Shepherds is 8.3 weeks. And again, the younger ones are less cute and the older ones are less cute too. So I'm thrilled with this story because it shows us how human attractiveness to dogs and affection for dogs fits exactly where it needs to be to have the maximum impact on dog survival. So it shows us how this affectionate bond can benefit the dogs. I like it for intellectual reasons. I also like it just for the fun of being able to say to people, okay, brace yourselves, because I'm going to show you photographs of dog puppies that science has proven are the cutest possible pups. So, okay, are you ready for this? Because you're going to feel a jolt. It's going to be so cute that it's going to really hit you. Did you get that? Did you get that? Aren't they unbelievably cute? These are 6, 7, or 8 weeks old, depending for each breed of dog, which was the cutest. These are the cutest possible images of dog heads that we could possibly make. Yeah, I still get a little tinkle, even though I've seen them many thousands of times. These are the least attractive on the younger side. These are the newborns, the earliest pictures we could get of the puppies in the first week of life. And these are the least attractive on the older side. These are the oldest dogs we had photographs of, 7 months old. I think these are still pretty handsome, but I can see that if you look up and down the columns and you imagine being given a choice between the 3 of any one breed, I think you would say, yeah, I would take the 6, 7, 8 week old. That is the cuter one. That doesn't mean that once you brought that dog into your home and started to develop a relationship with that individual, it doesn't mean you would jettison the individual just because it's got a bit older. I mean, none of us are getting cuter as we get older, but we hope we're not just going to be jettisoned, right? But if you were tempted by a new dog, it would be most likely to be a pup around weaning age. So as I said, my group, we don't do a lot of that kind of research because I view our subject of science as being the dog itself. We mainly study the dog's behavior. Seldom do we study human behavior. So that's all I'm going to tell you about how people love dogs. To a certain degree, I view that as an easier topic anyway, because you can ask people, what do you think of your dog? And they'll tell you they love their dog. So it's easier. How do we measure dogs' love for people? That is more the question that I am concerned with. Again, there are many different tests that can be done. I'm going to cut things down and tell you about one, again, a super simple test, because I love simple tests. And again, you can try this for yourselves. Here's all we're going to do. We're going to separate a person and her dog for a brief time. 10 minutes is enough. We're going to put the person on a chair and we're going to mark a 1 meter radius circle around that chair. So it's a little over 3 foot radius circle around the chair. Then we're going to let the dog back into the room with the person, and we're just going to measure for 2 minutes how much time does the dog spend inside the circle with their person. We're going to do this with dogs, and because if we're trying to claim that something is special to dogs, we need to compare them at the very least to wolves, to hand-reared wolves. So in this next slide, on the right, you're going to see a person sit down in a chair and her dog's going to do what her dog chooses to do. And on the left, you're at Wolf Park. And the exact same thing is happening at Wolf Park in one of the wolf enclosures. The woman you see sitting there is Dana Drenzik. I'll set the videos going. The woman you see on the left is Dana Drenzik, who helped raise that wolf. She's known that wolf since the wolf was 10 days old, and they see each other almost every day. They have a very intense relationship. The woman and dog on the right, I don't know them personally. They were just people participating in our studies, people and dogs participating in our studies, and they have the same kind of human and beloved pet relationship that we're accustomed to seeing in our own homes. No, they did not know each other when they were 10 days old. That human did not help raise that dog. I don't know how old that dog was when it came into the human's household, but it would have been later. It would have been at least after weaning, and it could have been a lot later for all I know. So you probably already noticed in the videos while I was talking that the dog showed a lot more excitement and interest in the person than the wolf in his person, even though the example with the dog is not perfect because the dog is clearly disturbed by something in the corridor at a point there. Okay, super simple. Again, you could try this for yourselves when you get home. Or we are all at home when we get off the lecture. We're just going to measure for this. How much time does the animal spend inside the circle with its person? We're only giving them 2 minutes. So going up the graph, how long the animal spent in proximity to the person. Here's what we find with the wolves. The wolves they're interested in this person. This is an important person for the wolves. They spend about a quarter of that interval, quarter of the 2 minutes inside the circle with their person. But now look at the dogs. The dogs, on average, spend almost the whole 120 seconds. I think it came out on average to like 118 seconds. So almost all the dogs spend almost all their time inside the circle with their human. And so this is an enormously big deal for me because I have repeatedly been comparing dogs and wolves and repeatedly failing to find any difference. Anything to do with intelligence, to do with smarts, to do with cognition, I cannot find a difference between dogs and wolves. Or if I do, then it looks like the wolves are actually doing better than the dogs, not the other way around. But here, with this unbelievably simple test, which I should mention was introduced to us by an Argentinian friend, Mariana Bentasela, this unbelievably simple test, and suddenly we get massive differences. And I'm not going to fill you in on everything we've done of this type, but we've done a number of tests trying to measure dogs and wolves' attraction towards the people that they know. And again and again and again, the dogs show way more interest, way more affection towards their people than the hand-reared wolves do. We then also collaborated with a geneticist who had identified some zones of the dog genome that showed evidence of having been under intense selection in recent times. Recent for evolution means thousands of years. So Bridget van Holt at Princeton University had already identified zones of interest in the dog genome where we might expect to find changes. And we sent her DNA samples from the dogs and the wolves that we tested. And she was actually able to pin down 3 genes in dogs that help account for the difference in affectionate drive between dogs and people. And geneticists have no obligation to come up with catchy names for their genes. So these 3 are called WBSCR17, GTF2I, and GTF2I-RD1. And it's very difficult to come up with any illustration of genetics, but this is just a plot showing the correlation between 2 of those 3 genes and the behaviors of interest. So we can see how dogs care for people in their behavior. That behavioral difference shows up in the genetics, the genetic differences between wolves and dogs. And so, for example, Professor Gregory Burns at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, has trained dogs to lie still in brain scanners, in MRI scanners. And by doing that, he's able to actually see the activation in the dog's brain when the dog is reminded about their beloved human by being shown a signal that means your human is just around the corner. And they can see how the dog's reward centers light up. For most dogs, the reward centers light up more when they're reminded of their beloved human than when they're shown an alternative signal that means you're just about to receive a piece of sausage. So for many of us, our dog loves us more than our dog loves sausages. I keep saying dogs have an exceptional ability to love people, but I'm going to contradict myself now because I don't think that dogs are born wanting to love people. I think dogs are born with an exceptionally open program to love anything that crosses their paths in the first couple of months of life. We see this in dogs loving us because we are human, and that is the lives that our dogs lead. They live with us and we see them loving us. But if your dog had been born on a farm and had grown up around many different species of animal, you would see your dog seeking out affectionate bonds with these many different species. This occurs most commonly in the dogs we call livestock guarding dogs, dogs who take care of livestock on ranches, most commonly goats and sheep, although sometimes cattle, sometimes horses. I wanted to see this for myself, having never come across it. And so I found some goat ranches in the northeast of Arizona, and I went out and visited with them where I saw this. Here is a beautiful picture of David and Catherine Henniger's goat, Tarragon, resting with her kid. You can see there's a young goat in there as well, resting on one of their livestock guarding dogs, Pierre. Now, why does Pierre have such a strong relationship with the goats? It's very simple. You just put the dog in the goat barn when it's a puppy, and it will grow up expecting, seeking strong emotional bonds with goats, the way that we are more accustomed to seeing dogs seeking strong emotional bonds with us. So I've seen this for myself. The example that I think is the cutest example I have ever heard of comes from Australia, where there's an island just offshore in the southeast of Australia called Middle Island that has a penguin colony on it. And unfortunately, at certain times of year, the tide goes out so far that foxes have been able to get out onto Middle Island and have repeatedly decimated the penguin population. That is until a local chicken farmer who goes by the name of Swampy Marsh suggested to the city authorities that they should try putting livestock guarding dogs out on Middle Island. He had dogs guarding his free-range chickens. He said, if the dogs can form a relationship with the chickens, why shouldn't they be able to start caring about penguins? And so that's exactly what they did. And as I say, I haven't seen this for myself yet, but it has to count as the cutest example I have ever heard of dogs caring for members of other species. These dogs love their penguins. Okay, finally, I want to tell you about some new research from my group where we've been looking into how far does dogs' concern for people actually go? And there are many stories, you know, the old Lassie story, what's that Lassie? Timmy's falling down the well. Well, clearly that's fiction, right? No dog can bark out clearly what on earth has happened. But what would a dog do if its person was in distress? And so in this video, which I'll show you brief highlights here, you can see here a box. In that box is this dog's special human. And she is crying out in distress from inside that box. The box is actually very easy to open, and we're interested to see, will the dog do something to rescue her human? We can tell the dog is upset. So in this case, the dog does rescue the human. I would be dishonest if I claimed that a majority of dogs rescue their humans under this condition, but we've done several control tests, and we know that the problem here is that even though we designed the box to be very easy to open, it's actually too challenging for most dogs who have not been trained what to do. Remember, that's an important consideration here. It's actually too challenging for most dogs. But the dogs that understand how to open it, they do open it to let their people out. So thank you very much for your time. I hope I've entertained and informed you a little bit. And there's a lot more of this kind of stuff in my book, Dog is Love, Why and How Your Dog Loves You.